regards to media, okay, so we have this kind of process that happened over the course of the past 70 or 80 years that Naomi Klein is trying to illustrate in this very zeitgeisty, very involved manner, using capitalism and politics and how the media basically channeled through these to create something that was in its way unprecedented. And she illustrates using some of the things that came out of it. But there was a six-step process that kind of got us from the culture that we had before, and in a way this is global, but especially in so-called first world countries, to where we are now. And the first step was beginning to use the media in that acculturation, beginning to take mom and pop stores, and instead you have this brand, you have your 30s version of Aunt Jemima, which I'm young enough that I don't even remember some of the examples that she used in the book. And that replaces that mom and pop, because now you're ordering from catalogs, you're ordering, you've got this industrial revolution where all of a sudden things are affordable, but, who are you buying from? And there's this disconnect, and anytime you have that in a culture, you experience dysphoria. And that dysphoria is something that's to be very carefully avoided. It's one of the reasons why we have things like emotional appeals that deal with grouping, why we have things like the heuristics and the credibility, and all of those things that are seen as marketing tools. So sometimes they're seen as not the most ethical of things, but what they do for a person, and the reason why they work is because they give them that sense of familiarity. They actually directly appeal to a person's psyche, and that it helps pull people through the times. And whether deliberately or not deliberately, and it's definitely portrayed in the book as deliberately, up-and-coming corporations chose to do that, to have these faces that represented brands, whereas previously, obviously you would go into a store and you would buy it, or you would pick up whatever it was that you were looking for. You were from Brown Sugar and very Anne of Green Gables, that sort of feel. It got replaced, and it got replaced originally by mail order catalogs. So that was the first media that went out, and it started to create this whole brand, this logo, this feeling that she's trying to explain from the beginning of the book to the very end, how we were essentially driven through this, and in a way how it passed us by, because people as a whole weren't educated in media and didn't or couldn't understand exactly what it was that was happening, because it was happening so fast that each cultural pushback, it happened after a generation would evolve, and it would kind of dawn on people, things are different now, and how are they different? And that's actually the next subject that she kind of delves into, which is the stage 2 of what went on in this whole media and branding process. So in this stage 2, we have that politics has now entered into the media, and they took that whole idea behind the storefront, in that big box version of that, and they applied it to politicians, and they started using the media to go ahead and to create this image for themselves and to really drive voters. So it wasn't so much word of mouth or sending somebody out anymore in that door-to-door sales kind of way. It was, death of a salesperson. We're moving on. We have a new way to get this message to people. And the youth market was especially susceptible to this for 2 reasons. The first one being applicable to politics, which is that they're always more open to new ideas. the youth market is always going to be your target market for, whoever the radical is, whoever the person with the newest, the best, the cutting edge for culture is going to be, because these people, their brain chemicals of a younger generation is naturally more inclined to change, and their brain plasticity is also higher. So that's something that you're going to experience. The consumerism side of it, the capitalistic side of it, which she really focuses on, is that the younger generation, the 20-somethings, your youth generation, which we now have more of because we have less farm work, and the first world countries have more of a laid-back market. There's less injuries, there's less death, you live longer, so you have this kind of middle ground where you're not a teenager, but you are working, but you're not grown up. You don't have a family, you don't have kids to take care of, you don't even necessarily have a mortgage. You don't have a lot of these things that took up so much of your capital for so many years. So now all of a sudden we have this incredibly large and growing subsection of the population that's very open to new ideas and has this great, to corporations, this great cash flow that they want to spend because they want to have this identity. Like I said, you're not going through some of the stages that you were going through in the same age groups as you were. 20-somethings don't necessarily have a baby. If they do, maybe they wait till 28, 29. It's towards the end there. And maybe into your 30s, it's something that's starting to evolve. In a weird way, it broke down the family structure that was there before. Previously, you were always dependent on your family. Up through the 1900s, you wound up Social Security, you wound up with all of these little nuts to help catch you, because there was an increasing independence on the part of our youth market. And obviously, corporations are going to encourage this. They want that free-flowing capital. They want these people to, want to take risks, and then, as a byproduct, which I'm sure, kept the whole wheels turning and really greased them, these people now lacked an identity for a decade of their life where they weren't children, but they weren't parents either. And I used to joke around when I was younger, you're not an adult until you have a child. And it was something I said before I had a kid, because I recognized that in myself, and it was definitely something that I said after I had a kid, where I was 1,000% correct on that one. You are not a grown-up until you have a child, because until then, you don't have to make sacrifices in your life. I mean, maybe, there's unforeseen circumstances. There's always extenuating circumstances, the exceptions that make the rule. But you don't have to give up things in general in your 20s unless you go ahead and you have kids. So these people aren't really adults. They have a whole lot of money. They have their own space. They're independent. But who are they? And you start to get that cultural pushback. You start to get, that they have this not only money but time to contemplate the fact that there's this very cavern of Socrates thing going on, where we can only see the shadows on the wall, and we're not aware of the fact that the wall's been sold, is how the book puts it. Where this generation starts to become aware of the fact that something's going on. And they don't really know what it is, they just have little bits and pieces. So they're starting to reflect on that, and that branding is leaking into politics, and they're starting to push back at that and try to get involved with it because they want to have an identity, and part of that is being manipulated by corporations, by commerce, and part of it is not. Part of it is becoming political activism as we knew it, not necessarily as we know it, because it was focused on these issues that are questionable if we can even grasp them, even as a quote-unquote first world country. Should we be concerned about restrictions in China? That question was never asked, but the growing awareness, because people just wanted that identity and that interaction, was that we were. So she had gotten into this whole idea about, values versus value statements, and, people had gotten really involved in this, idea that what they were consuming made an impact in the world. And I'm not saying that it doesn't. I'm saying that they weren't educated to the point where understand how to handle that. So basically what we came away with was the branding of the self and the fact that the brands kind of went into a place instead of just in the media. You know, they were represented certain ways, etc., etc. And then the media, of course, started invading like literally every aspect of our lives. I don't think anybody could have foreseen the media boom that we're going through today. They never in a million years would have predicted this. You know, back in the 80s, they were calling like flying cars, not iPads. You know, they were looking for that sort of science and technology, looking at that sort of science and technology, because they didn't understand the power of media. They didn't understand what it does to you, as far as your chemicals in your brain and as far as the experience that gives you psychologically, how gripping this is and how big of a facet of your life it becomes. So it's the new opiate. It's the new opiate for parenting. All of our kids grow up on iPads now. All of our teenagers have smartphones. If your kid doesn't have a smartphone, then either they feel left out or they're a pain in your butt. Generally, they feel left out. It is a thing that is there now, and it was growing even back then. You know, the internet launched in, I think, the mid-70s. It was something that was growing. TV got bigger when my father was younger. I remember him telling me TV didn't come on until, I think it was 3 p.m. There was no TV. They didn't play any shows. And for the MTV generation, I could not even imagine that. I mean, I don't even really watch TV, and I still can't imagine it not, like, existing. Like, there not being, not even the 3,000 channels, but, you know, that there just not being any channels before 3 p.m. because, you know, people were at work or whatever the reason for it was. So it became this opiate. But it also became, because it was an opiate, because it was so much a part of people's lives and how to, I don't want to say control them, but how to drive them and how to move them. You know, because sometimes there was a positive political agenda. You know, the FTC, when they got involved to break up monopolies. They got involved, you know, because of concerns over this sort of thing, you know, to have diversity. And that it might not have been a move that was entirely, you know, pro-political, because you started to get PACs and you started to get companies that had, you know, these value statements, which was good, you know, that gave them balance, and maybe they even lobbied for it. But, you know, also companies that just cared about value, you know, big box stores that were, you know, just had everything, and they wanted the government to give them everything on a silver platter because they were major money makers, you know, even though we tax them less and less and less. But whatever, you know, we want to have them in America, or whatever first world country. I'm sure everybody in the Western world has that. And, you know, developed nations elsewhere as well. So we had that opiate, and it started to be regulated, and it started to kind of have this immersive marketing and branding experience where you couldn't have all one thing, and that was regulated, but when you went somewhere, you had all one experience. So, you know, the Target layout is a modern version of this. You know, where you go in and you have a certain feel, even though there's like 8 million items in the store and 10,000 associates, you're going to have that same experience everywhere from Target. So they diversified, they made sure that they diversified insofar as which corporations, you know, there couldn't just be one corporation, but, you know, they diversified as far as holdings went. But the trend was to give one experience, because that was your brand, and brand started going into marketing, and brand started becoming incredibly important. And then after that, we ran into merchandising and control. You know, as I mentioned, people started to get, or excuse me, corporations were starting getting incredibly political. They were huge international driving forces, and they felt as a result that they deserved a voice in the world. And the problem is, you know, things like Citizens United give them a lot of power, where they can really rock the vote simply by pouring what they want into the media, and then whoever gets into office owes them. You know, they can take their merchandise overseas and give it out to, you know, sweatshop laborers. They can do that. You know, that is legal for them to do. And there was this feeling that it was, you know, really left up to the consumer to take responsibility for that, and that probably came about in no small part because of, you know, the recession, where people were like, our jobs are going overseas, we need to do something about this, you know, and they started to give this very, I remember an incredibly moving quote from Hitler that I ran into, where he was explaining to, I think, one of his, you know, lieutenant generals or whatever, that the hatred of the Jews was so important for his political campaign, for his you know, media blast, that kept Nazi Germany and kept, you know, the whole Nazi regime rolling. That was so key because it made an outgroup, and that there was an in-grouping. And so the pushback naturally there would be, you know, if our jobs are going overseas, then, you know, people went hunting for that sort of, you know, as Naomi Campbell just describes it more as a social responsibility. But with the recession, you also have to look at the aspect where, did these people who lost their jobs and are looking now back again at what is it that's happening in their lives that's different? Your 20-somethings are starting to mature and realize, you know, what they buy has impact. And it got branded out, ironically, as social responsibility on the part of a first world country to look at labor conditions. You know, the part that I always heard growing up was, you know, oh my God, these people over there, you know, they live in a place where it might catch fire and they might burn to death. And that was the whole thing. But the other part of that is they're getting paid $2 an hour, and it's not a question of whether or not that $2 an hour is ethical in their culture. A lot of them were coming in from an agricultural section and deliberately working in these places. The fact that there was a choice was often ignored, because in our side of the culture, in our home culture, all of a sudden we're losing jobs, you know, so great, you know, they're making it for $2 an hour and we can now buy, you know, whatever it is, you know, my jeans or my shirt for so much less, but I don't have the money to buy them anymore because my job is gone. You know, there's this, you know, trend down in work where we don't have the money to buy things anymore. So that $2 is very representative, because it means I'm only worth $2. And there was that side of the coin that started to be represented in this whole merchandising and control struggle. After that came culture jamming. That was stage 5. So stage 5 is this culture jamming. I love culture jamming. I mean, as a student of culture and communication, even before then, psychology and philosophy, I adore culture jamming. I love to see people go in there and just throw something in the works, because to me that is open source. Like, that is what technology companies like Google do, where you are going to introduce a foreign body in there and just see what the heck happens to your platform. That to me is incredible. But the way she described it was that the whole cult of personality that got built up around these faces that were created for brands started to get a pushback again, and we run into this continuously in her narrative about, you know, she's obviously an activist in her activist life, where she got very excited by, you know, these the spiders and the billboard, you know, graffiti and you know, huge fan of Banksy and everything, but that's a little bit much for me. You're trashing money that somebody put in, and we want money in our economy. So there has to be a practical aspect, but as far as the concept went, there's culture jamming for a political pushback and, you know, attention versus the progress. You know, how is this contributing to the movement, and what's the bottom line? And later on, at the end of her narrative, she actually mentions, you know, in the midst of all of this excitement and these poppy things and these new terms and these trends and being activist and, you know, taking these stances, that the education fell by the wayside again. And once again, we had that very cavern of Socrates effect, where after the fact, you look back and you wonder, you know, not how did we get here because you were there for it, but what should we have done instead? Because the issues of poverty were ignored, and the major corporations became such a target that what people originally went in for, that sort of what is my agenda, was kind of ignored by this popularized movement instead. And you gotta wonder, did corporations do that on purpose? Did they popularize this, kind of negative home image to gain footage in their overseas labor and to make profit? Because it worked, it worked, and some of these issues weren't resolved. And the bottom line is culture jamming is hot, and it'll give you data. And if you're a student who actually studies, you can learn a lot from doing that kind of thing, and from really questioning, from having an incredibly a searching viewpoint. But when you popularize that sort of thing and you make it into a movement, what are you really doing? Like, what comes after that? And that wasn't explored at the time. People were so into, the frenetics of it, that to keep attention abroad, to villainize big corporations, that they didn't look at tax in DC, and they didn't look at what's minimum wage here, and they didn't look at, we're the consumers, can we do stuff for ourselves? And there was that whole rainbow fish, altruism is good, and self-gratification is bad, that Ayn Rand eventually pushed back against. That was kind of driving this movement. Okay, and then there was stage 6, where counterculture eventually became culture. Your 20-somethings and your teens, people, bigger brothers and sisters and so on, who have been swept up on this, they grew up. They had kids, they became adults, they got the house, they got the picket fence, they got the dog, the 2.5 kids, and they settled down. And, what eventually came out of that, what got us there, and what is still there out of that. She wraps up the whole thing with a mention again, and she mentioned about halfway through, of did we actually address the key issues, or were we simply caught up in something that we felt was greater than us, but was actually a group identity? Again, recursively, she mentions that corporations targeted people to give them a group identity, and that's what you were purchasing with the value statement. You were purchasing an identity. And when it was all said and done, and you didn't have your clique of friends anymore, and you didn't have, $1,000 of disposable cash anymore, and the housing market crashed, and the credit card market crashed, and all of that good stuff, what was left, looking back as an overview, how did it get there? And I thought one of the really interesting things that she kind of didn't mention was that mass media covers things, but it doesn't necessarily take a responsibility in education. And while it is privatized, it is federally regulated, and it is a communication media. And I think that it's an incredibly controversial stance to say that it has a responsibility to educate us. But as I show in a previous slide, they certainly have that capacity. And if they adopt the same value statements as, for instance, Starbucks, ethical coffee, etc., they will have the power to be able to put out messages that are more educational, that actually let us know what's going on in a self-reflecting manner as it's going on. Like, what is media as media? And you can educate someone very easily in that, using simple media. YouTube is out there. it's a great resource, but it's not mainstream. It's not one of the 3,000 cable channels. It's not one of the 5 major news networks. It's people can get to the data now, and that's awesome, and that's great that that the counterculture and the whole we have this identity of freedom sort of push got us that far. But insofar as what did media do as a medium to allow this to happen? Quite a lot. And that's in every aspect of media. It's in paper media, it's in advertisement, it's in mainstream news networks, it's everywhere, where we don't want our media to have any agenda other than our own identity. MSNBC if you're a liberal, Fox News if you're a Republican, that sort of thing. Comedy Central if you're edgy and hip, and Democratic generally, unless you watch Stephen Colbert and take it seriously. But the question that she leaves us with, and the question that the challenge I think that No Logo is offering is this very meta parallax that people ran into before, and they're running into it again, where you can really self-reflect and take yourself or the message out of the media and look at the medium itself and see what it's doing now. And what it's doing is actually not progressive. You're not learning, you don't have a social parallax from the mainstream media, and you can't just blame that on corporations, although she does. I really feel that she does. I grew up with social responsibility. I grew up with global warming, and that was a big push. How to be green, how to recycle, all of that. A lot of that was put on the individual, and we had to push for recycling in the communities. And we, still down south, I had to drive to a recycling center, and I had to, feel the social responsibility to stop global warming, to stop, to use Brita instead, to have these clean alternatives. And while it is a movement, it's more of a responsible movement and less of a catchy, there's not really a brand to it. You're not going to say, oh, super ego-friendly, or ego-friendly, irony, shirts and so on, that fell by the wayside, the responsibility on the individual. And I think that that's something that we need to push for in media regulation, because the way that the message gets to us is so much more important, in my opinion, well, not in hers, than the deliverer or the delivery of the message. Walmart actually said something that stuck in my head, which is they started carrying organic food, and they said, we'll carry whatever it is that you'll buy. And I don't think a lot of people like that, because it puts a responsibility back on the consumer. But ultimately, that's where it lands, and we're voters, and a lobbyist is someone who goes and sits in a lobby, and that's what an activist does. And putting control of the media back into our hands is our responsibility. And I'm not going to lie, I don't have a whole lot of optimism about that being done. Because, believe it or not, 80 years later, we're still a nation of people who want our opiates. And not so much, we want our groups, and not so much independent thinking and independent research, and really pushing for that.